Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. We're really fired up about this issue of Alaskan interceptions of BC salmon, and we're really glad to have the opportunity to share what we know with you and answer some questions. Um, we all know that many of our salmon and steelhead runs are struggling these days due to a number of factors, from climate impacts to fish farm pathogens to habitat loss and pollution and overfishing. And we're here talking about overfishing today. And here in BC, we've had a lot of overfishing in our past, and there's still some of that happening. But we've had some unprecedented fishery closures over the past few years to help stop the decline of some of our most at-risk salmon runs, and to give them a chance to rebuild. And these closures have been really tough on a lot of communities and families who rely on fish for food and for their livelihoods. And of course, our ecosystems are struggling as well. But just across our northwest border in southeast Alaska, there have not been nearly the same degree of reductions in fishing impacts on our fish. And so that has been a growing concern of ours. Many people in BC have been aware of this issue and working on it for years, but it really seemed to us over the last few years that the problem was getting worse. So in order to better understand the impacts and the knowledge gaps on the issue, SkeenaWild and Watershed Watch commissioned an independent technical report that we put out about 2 years ago. And that was a really big landmark report that it compiled a ton of data and identified the knowledge gaps. And it confirmed that Alaskan fisheries are catching a growing proportion of several BC salmon and steelhead populations, many of which are at historic lows, and that there are major shortcomings in how those Alaskan fisheries are monitoring and dealing with their impacts on those at-risk populations. So in response, we kicked up a fuss, we generated a lot of media attention, and we pushed our politicians to take the issue more seriously. And we've made some progress, but we have a lot of work to do if we're going to turn the tide on this impact. And that's going to take all of us working together to get that done. And the first step to really working effectively together is to get the facts out there as far and wide as we can. So with that, we're going to hear first from Kaitlin Yehle from SkeenaWild. She's a fisheries biologist, and she's going to get into the nitty gritty of Alaskan interceptions and provide a sneak peek at the data and the update that we're releasing in a few weeks to our report. And please make sure that if you want to get that report when it comes out, that it's that you're signed up for email updates, so you'll get a link when it's made public. And then after Kate, we're going to hear from David Mills from Watershed Watch about how we're meeting this threat and how you can help. And then we're going to have a question and answer session with our awesome panel, who I will introduce later. And so if you have questions, just a reminder for those who have joined in the last few minutes, you can put them in the Q&A box in the app here, and then you can upvote questions that you like from others. So over to you, Kaitlin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. Let me just share my screen, make sure this is working. Can you let me know that you can see that?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and I'm happy to be joining today from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory that I'm privileged to call home. As Aaron mentioned, I'm a biologist with SkeenaWild Conservation Trust, and I'm going to be showing you some data. So to get started, hopefully everybody on here is familiar with salmon migration patterns, but generally salmon head out to sea for their adult stage and then return to spawn and tend to return along the coast. This is a very general pattern, and this is for North Coast populations as well as Southeast Alaskan populations. And if you look at the right-hand side, this is just a close-up of the North Coast. So focusing on the Skeena and Nass rivers, which if you're not familiar with the North Coast, because I know we might have lots of people more familiar with South Coast joining us today. The Skeena and Nass River are the second and third largest salmon-bearing rivers in BC after the Fraser River. sustaining salmon populations, ecosystem functioning, as well as First Nations communities and fisheries along those watersheds, as well as commercial and recreational salmon fishing opportunities. So because of these migration patterns, it leaves BC and also Washington and Oregon salmon susceptible, vulnerable to interception in fisheries that occur in Southeast Alaska. And just going into very briefly a little bit of these fishing areas and fisheries where this occurs. On the right-hand side, we'll start there. We're looking at fishing areas in British Columbia. So on the north coast, Area 3 is approach to Nass, Area 4 is to the Skeena. And then just north of that, hopefully you can see my mouse, but just north of that, looking at Alaska fishing districts, we have, this is in darker gray is what's the southeast fishing district. And then there's south-southeast, which is, where we're focusing in districts. On the map, they're 1 to 6. It's also 101 to 106 respectively. So 4 or District 104 on the outer coast here is where a lot of those interceptions occur, salmon that are migrating further south. And then as well, District 1 or 101 is the approach to Nass, so significant interceptions there. And in particular, the fisheries that we're talking about are the purse seine fishery, so that targets pink salmon. And there's significant purse seine fishery, well, in many of these districts, but in particular, we're talking about in 104 today, as well as in 101. And then in 101, there's also the Tree Point gillnet fishery, which targets hatchery chum salmon produced in Southeast Alaska and returned to Southeast Alaska. And then also the Southeast Alaskan troll fishery, which operates on the outer coast and targets Chinook and coho salmon. And I just do want to highlight that the purse seine fishery, which is targeting pink salmon, which occurs along the outer coast, there's the pink salmon that it's targeting are not returning to rivers on that outer coast. So the majority of pink are produced in systems that are more in the inside waters, which is the pink circles on the map there. And so I'm going to talk mostly about North Coast today, but I did just want to mention that interceptions occur for many systems in BC. So this is just an interactive map that you can find on our website, which is kind of neat. And it's just showing different colors are different species of salmon, and that there is, some data for interceptions, not just North Coast, but on Vancouver Island and in the Fraser watershed as well. So Aaron sort of covered this, but we knew this was an issue and wanted to understand the impact. So this was before I started with SkeenaWild, but in January of 2022, released these reports summarizing the knowledge that was available on interceptions of BC salmon. And I just want to acknowledge that this work was by Andrew Rosenberger, Victoria Educated, and Greg Taylor. And they worked really hard to pull together information from many different sources, a massive effort to talk to different people and pull that data together. And the intention was always for it to be a living document. So that's why I've been working on it with Andy over the past year or so to try and get some updates out and available. And that's what I'm sharing some of today. And I do just want to state as well that we welcome feedback and additional information. The idea is for it to be comprehensive. So we'd love to hear from you if you do have information. I'm going to go through some updates sort of in the same format as the report series. So I'll start with just a general overview of Southeast Alaskan harvest in 2023, last fishing season, and then do some updated impacts by species. However, of course, we have a pretty short time today. So I'm not covering all species, and I'm not covering any species in depth. So if you do have specific questions about different species or areas, you're welcome to pop them into the chat. And if I can't answer them today, I'm happy to follow up. And then I'll hand it over to Dave to talk about solutions and what we're doing about it. So looking at, recent history and last year's harvest in Southeast Alaska. So in this picture, we have a time frame. So 2023 is this last bar on the right, and different colors indicate different species of salmon. And so what you can see if you look just at 2023, that the majority of salmon that are harvested in this district are pink salmon, and then followed by chum as a second. But in particular, in 2023, Southeast had the largest harvest that they've had in over a decade. So pretty significant harvest last year, and that was, in part due to very good pink returns last year. And so you can see the numbers, over 47 million pink harvested last year, over 15.5 million chum. And for all species, over 65 million salmon. And then just looking at districts 101 and 104, which I had mentioned earlier, still very significant harvest, total of over 18 million. And just to put that in comparison, so just south of that, like total BC commercial harvest has been between 2 and 3 million in recent years, around 2.5. So that's Canadian commercial fisheries have really reduced in response to declining salmon populations. And so just the magnitude of fisheries that are occurring just north of the border, it's pretty different. And just to point out, for different species in which fisheries a lot of that harvest is occurring. So here we have by species, each box is a species, and then along the x-axis, there's different fisheries. So the ones that I've talked about, the southern purse seine fishery, indicated by this red arrow. So you can see that's, the majority of sockeye harvest, and this is for 2023, just to be specific. And then as well, the majority of pink is harvested in there. The summer troll, which I've talked about, troll on the outer coast. So you can see coho and Chinook, that's where they're mostly harvested. And then for chum, you can see that a lot of the harvest is in hatchery terminal fisheries or cost recovery. But there is still significant, or there was last year, and generally is still significant harvest in the purse seine fishery, where a lot of interceptions occur. So diving into species a little bit, I'm going to start with Chinook, and I'm not going to get too detailed with recent Chinook updates, but as a general overview, about 70% of Chinook that are harvested in Southeast Alaska are harvested in the troll fishery. And within the troll fishery, up to 97% of those Chinook are non-Alaskan origin. So this is for Chinook in particular, or let me rephrase that. Chinook in particular are a good example of interceptions of many BC and further south Washington and Oregon coast populations. So the graph that's showing on the right here, this is from genetic data, so GSI stock composition, and this is for 2019, so it's not super recent, but this is, as I understand it anyway, somewhat representative of general trends in recent years. And so troll fishery operates in the winter, spring, and summer. And what you can see here is each color represents a different regional stock group. So there's the Columbia River, ECVI is East Coast Vancouver Island, North and Central BC in orange, Oregon coast. Oh, I had that wrong. I think that's, there we go. There's some different shades of orange in there. And then Southeast and Transboundary are combined together, South Thompson River, Washington, West Coast, Vancouver Island. And so this is the proportion of Chinook that are caught in that troll fishery. So one, that would be the full proportion. And so what you can see, big things that stand out to me here, in the summer troll, it's dominated by South Thompson Chinook. And in particular, Southeast and Transboundary, that light green color, is a very small proportion, especially in the summer, but, throughout the entire year. So they're really not targeting Southeast Chinook. And then in addition to that, I just want to point out that in the purse seine and gillnet fisheries, most of the season, retention of Chinook is not allowed. There are certain weeks that it is. But during those weeks when it's not allowed, there's no requirement to record or report the numbers of Chinook that are caught and released. So what you have here is just an example of a Alaska Department of Fish and Game compiled report in season from last year, and you can see that zeros are reported for Chinook. Of course, we know that they are catching them and releasing them. And due to the way they're fished, which is unsustainable, release mortality is greater than 90%. So all those Chinook that are being caught or released, mostly dead, and there's no record of it. Moving on to chum, just a brief summary of last year. So 2023, Southeast Alaska had the largest harvest of chum since the year 2000. So very significant last year, over greater than 15.5 million chum harvested. And again, many of those are hatchery produced chum in Southeast Alaska, but about 3.5 million were harvested in the southern seine fishery. So that's in the lower graph here. And we don't have a lot of data. We don't really have any data at all on how many of those might have been returning to waters outside of Southeast Alaska. And this significant harvest last year coincides with very poor returns across North and Central Coast BC in 2023. So in general, North and Central Coast chum have been depressed for many, many years. This is a significant problem. There's not a lot of chum fisheries at all in Canada. And then we've heard from fisheries managers in Haida Gwaii on the Central Coast that they think some of the wild chum returns last year were the worst they've ever seen. So of course, I'm not saying that this is because they were harvested in Alaska, but it really highlights the need to have more information available to understand how that fishery is impacting our wild chum population. I think I've covered most of this already, but yeah, most of the chum harvest that does occur is in Southeast Alaska. There's not much harvest in Canada at all. From what we do know, recent exploitation rates in the Southeast of about 12% on North Coast BC populations. But this data is based on run reconstruction, which is based on pink salmon tagging studies from the 80s. So, really not reliable, and we need better information on this. So we need Alaska to be collecting genetic information on the chum that they're harvesting and sharing that.
Hey, Kate, just to let you know, 2 minutes left.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. I'm gonna have to blitz through some stuff. Okay, so
you can squeeze another minute or two in there if you need to.
Thanks. Yeah. NAS and Skeena sockeye for last year. There's some summaries there. I won't cover it just in the interest of time, but what is important here is that, in more recent years, Canada has really reduced commercial fisheries on sockeye. And so of the sockeye, NAS and Skeena sockeye that are harvested, which you can see in this graph, NAS on the top, Skeena on the bottom, a larger proportion in recent years is in Alaska. And apart from looking at that at an aggregate scale, it's really important to understand this for different populations. So this graph is a little bit complex, and I'll try and break it down pretty quickly here. But these are different conservation units of Skeena sockeye. And then Alaskan exploitation rate is on the x-axis. So the further right is a higher exploitation rate. And then for each population, there's two bars. There's a red bar and a blue bar. And the blue bar is the 10-year data average, and then red is older than that. And what you can see at the top here for the populations that have the highest exploitation rates in Alaska, like the bean late wild, which is at the top, is that in the recent 10 years, Alaskan harvest has actually increased on that population. So really concerning for some of those populations that being late wild. You can see, there was a year that it was over 50%. So that means Alaska harvested over 50% of the run that year. Really concerning for that being late wild population. I'm going to talk about them for a sec, because it was historically the largest population of sockeye returning to the Skeena, sustaining First Nations and commercial fisheries, and has greatly reduced. I'm going to show that graph in a second, but so this is just Alaskan exploitation over time series, and you can see it's really increased as compared to Canada, which has declined over the same time period. And to put this into the context of the size of the population, we have in dark gray escapement, in light gray Canadian harvest, and in red Alaskan harvest from 1960 to 2022, I believe, is in here. And then on the right-hand side, it's just a close-up of the most recent 10 years. So, you know, that population has had very low returns over the past 20 years or so. I think they've experienced about a 90% decline. And in recent years, a significant harvest in Alaska. So a really big problem for that population. And I'll just quickly talk about steelhead. I know there's probably some people here pretty interested in it, and we have had some updates here. So one thing to note is that Babbing late wild, which I just talked about, is our proxy population for steelhead, because we really don't have information on steelhead. They can't be retained except for personal use in Southeast fisheries. However, there's no requirement to release them with the least possible harm like there is in Canada. There's no requirement to record and report numbers caught and released. So we really have no information specific to catch or exploitation rates. Again, we estimate greater than 90% mortality of those that are released. And so we've done some estimates based on proxy populations, like I just mentioned. I'll skip this. This is historic harvest of steelhead in Southeast. It'll be in the updated report, so that'll come out soon, but just showing that we know that steelhead are intercepted. There were records of it prior to non-retention. For Skeena steelhead, so again, I just mentioned, but we modeled exploitation rates after late Babbing wild sockeye. So that's based on that they have similar run timing and migration patterns. So there are some assumptions and uncertainties with these estimates. We set release mortality between 85 and 95%. And just to note that this is all based on escapement data from the Tyee. So, you know, if there's inaccuracies there, that would affect it as well. You can see is an increasing trend for exploitation of Skeena steelhead. And then again, to put that into context with how Skeena steelhead has been doing, the past 5 years on the right hand, far right here, Skeena steelhead have had, they've had low returns for the past 5 years, below levels of conservation concern. So that's what these dashed lines are. The yellow one is the threshold for conservation concern. The red one is for extreme conservation concern. So you can see in 2021, which was the lowest return ever on record, I believe it was about 5,600 fish. And we estimate that was the year that Alaskan exploitation was around 50%. So, you know, a very significant harvest of steelhead in recent years, which is very concerning. And then lastly, I'll just mention that there is data for NAS steelhead available as well now, not done by us, but will be incorporated, which is super exciting to see and follows a similar assumptions that we use for Skeena steelhead and information as well. Just quite significant harvest of NAS steelhead in Alaskan fisheries as well. And that's it. I'm going to hand it over to Dave to talk about what we're doing about all this. And thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Kaitlin. And just to jump in quickly before Dave starts, I don't know if Megan has already shared it, but if not, Megan, could you please share the link with folks to the Alaska's Dirty Secret action page so people can take action and send a letter while they're listening to the webinar? Okay, thanks, Kate. Over to you, Dave. Dave is Watershed Watch's fisheries advisor. Who's going to tell you what we're going to do about the problem?
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Aaron. I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing our campaign and then just shift over to some solutions. But it's worth emphasizing kind of what is probably an obvious point, and that is, you know, campaigns don't exist without people that support them. So here in BC, we are lucky to have a community of people who care about wild salmon and are engaged, and those people are spread out, you know, all throughout BC, and they are interested in the issue. They're engaged in their local watersheds. They're part of fisheries commissions. They're part of Indigenous communities. And they're similar to people all across the Pacific Northwest and you know, BC, Washington, Oregon, and of course Alaska as well. So the takeaway is that the people who support wild salmon here in BC and across the Pacific Northwest are the strong point of this campaign. And that's not just us saying that. Every time we go out to polling, we see an increasing number of people rank salmon as one of the #1 priorities when it comes to issues around the environment. This most recent poll comes out from Insights West, showing 92% of people agreeing that salmon are a huge part of our culture. So we're seeing increase for support for the protection of wild salmon, and that's one of the reasons why our campaign is off to a successful start. So going over how we develop a campaign and how we run it, I kind of like to use the hybrid model as a way of describing it. So that's a mixture of old school and new school techniques, the most important of which are just conversations with people across our region and beyond. And this list, you can see like a really large number of stakeholders who over the past few years, we've been we're meeting them where they're at, whether that's out in the field, on the rivers, on Zoom meetings, in conference rooms, in ministers' offices. We've been able to take the time to engage people, hear what their concerns are, and give them the information about Alaskan interceptions that they may have been missing in the past. It's in this day and age, salmon might not be the #1 issue for politicians, and people are living in often silos away, and media is not doing a great job of covering the issue all the time. So these one-on-one conversations are just super critical for us. Moving online, we're able to provide opportunities to get people involved by finding our audiences and placing ads in front of them. So this would be where we're moving into some of the newer school techniques. So these are our search ads or social media ads that show up in front of people when they show an interest in salmon or steelhead, and that helps us develop a larger audience and add it to the list of people who are engaged on this issue. And then, of course, we are giving them opportunities to take action with modern campaign tools like New Mode that allow us and our supporters to send letters to decision makers. So that kind of in a nutshell goes over how this sort of hybrid campaign works. Is it working? So in the past 2 years, we've been able to generate about 2,000 letters to the Marine Stewardship Council. We've been able to get 2,000 letters off to the cabinet. And we're seeing that Alaskan interceptions are now the #1 issue at the Pacific Salmon Treaty Commission for our commissioners. This is a huge sea change. We're also seeing our senior politicians in BC publicly standing behind us. Again, this is a massive change from where we were a couple of years ago. And now the Marine Stewardship Council, which is responsible for providing certifications that give some of these Alaskan fisheries cover in the marketplace. We put this issue on the table in front of them. They're now having to reconsider whether or not Alaskan fisheries are actually sustainable. So is this enough? Alaska is a global seafood powerhouse. They generate over $15 billion in economic activity each year. And at the moment, there's no incentive for them to come to the negotiating table. Canada no longer has the leverage that we used to have. We used to be able to reduce their allocation of sockeye, but as our populations have decreased, that is no longer on the table for us. So we don't have the leverage at the treaty table. So we're having to look out at Alaska's market for options to get their attention. And Alaska's facing some headwinds out there in the world. We've seen this with the court decisions. We've seen this with the collapse in salmon prices, and we've seen some pretty shocking things happen out in their other fisheries. So we think at this time, Alaska is vulnerable, and this might be a good opportunity for us to reach their decision makers. So I'm going to use the District 104 fishery in the southeast that Kate has given you a lot of details about as an example, because that District 104 fishery, you know, it is a good example of where they're vulnerable. They're facing intense scrutiny here. They're intercepting south migrating stocks, but it's actually a fishery that's dominated by wealthy vessel owners from Seattle. And the total landed catch value, I'm estimating it here for sort of an average year, you know, $30 million is a rounding error in terms of the total value for their fishery. So what were to happen if we were to remove some of these obstacles? And what were to happen if Alaska was just to move the 50 odd boats or so that fish on the outside waters to the inside? We'd see a lot of the problems go away. Oops, sorry. So we go from here over to here, and we're no longer intercepting south migrating stocks. The pressure's taking off, the pressure's reduced, and we've got a very elegant solution. And it's worth noting that there's a ton of precedent for a solution like this. In the past, Canadian fisheries have been bought out by Alaska, and we're presently in Canada buying out fisheries to reduce the pressure. So this is a very common and simple solution. So this is something that is possible, but we're not waiting for it to happen. So this year, we're going to be raising key issues in the key markets for Alaska. We're laying the groundwork for some legal action, and we're keeping an eye on the ultimate solution, which is the protection of BC wild salmon at the treaty table. So with that, I will hand it back to Aaron. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Some good questions coming in here. We are noting them. And yeah, we're going to invite our panel in now. So I and before we do that, I just sort of recap some of these solutions that Kate and Dave have put forward. And so first of all, we need to move the fisheries in the seine and gillnet fisheries in the southern tip of Southeast Alaska to inside waters where they will be catching Alaskan mammal populations and not intercepting BC fish. Reduce the Chinook and troll, the Chinook and Goho troll fisheries along the outer coast, and collect DNA for chum, pink, and steelhead in Southeast Alaskan fisheries so we can know what populations are being intercepted and get a more clear understanding of the impact on BC. And then require live release of bycatch species like Chinook and steelhead, as is required in BC fisheries and any other, most modern fisheries, and bring in independent monitoring to ensure that those regulations are being adhered to. So, and then the way that we're going to get to some of those things is we need to reform the Pacific Salmon Treaty, which gets renewed in 2028. So that's what we're working towards over the next couple of years to get the conditions in place where we're going to see a Pacific Salmon Treaty that addresses the issues. And I think Greg will talk more about that. And hopefully we could also have Canada buy out some of these most problematic fisheries. So with that, I'm going to introduce our awesome panel. So you already know Kate and Dave. Greg Knox is joining us as well. He's the executive director of SkeenaWild Conservation Trust. And Kirby Muldoe, Hupwalaksa is SkeenaWild's Indigenous engagement lead. So welcome, panel. So our first question, I guess we'll skip right to this treaty issue, and I'll put this to Greg. Doesn't the Pacific Salmon Treaty deal with these interception issues?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone, for joining. The short answer to that is no. I've been on the northern panel of the Pacific Salmon Treaty for 14 years. And so I'm pretty familiar with that whole process and what works and what doesn't. And so the treaty was built in the mid-80s, 1985. It came into effect. It was really in an era where salmon kind of were much more stable in terms of their productivity and their returns. It was really designed to, one, not overfish each other's salmon populations, and also make sure each country was getting roughly the number of fish that they were producing out of their river systems. So that they could benefit, and also to share basic information and to understand the impacts from each of the countries on each other's salmon populations. And it's not meeting any of those objectives anymore. And even early on, it wasn't doing a great job of it. But now with our environmental variability we're seeing from climate change, the treaty is not designed to deal with these issues. And it's not working. As Kate mentioned, we used to harvest in British Columbia about 24 million salmon a year. Now we're harvesting about 2.5 million. So we're 10% of what we used to fish. And Alaska has basically ramped up their harvest in southern areas like 104 in the 1990s. And their impacts have either been staying the same or in some cases increasing on our salmon populations in steelhead. And the treaty, Canada has very little leverage inside the treaty to deal with these issues. Alaska basically refuses to negotiate, and their fishermen are really in the driver's seat. When they get up, if they don't like to talk about something, they get up out of their seats, they leave the room, and the meeting's shut down, and that's kind of the end of our negotiation. So we can never really talk about the substantive issues at the treaty table. That's starting to change because of our governments have really got on board with making this a real priority. But we need leverage outside the process to make the changes we need inside the process. And so all these things that Aaron and Dave have been talking about are really key to getting real change. So I'll just leave it there, I guess.
Great, thanks, Greg. So another question that it wasn't in the chat here, but has come up that I just wanted to put to Kirby is how is this issue? How are these interception fisheries affecting First Nations and their ability to meet their food needs in BC?
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all the participants. Over the past almost 50 years, I've been fishing on the coast and in the rivers in Skeena. I've seen salmon populations take a nosedive. And so one of the things I wanted to point out was that, we no longer see the 100-pound springs or kings, as they call them in Alaska, that we used to see. And it's because of the fishing techniques and the fishing gear. On top of this, we have climate change. In the Skeena, we don't start food fishing until we don't start food fishing until there's a significant amount of salmon that have gone past the counting stations. So we're doing a lot in BC to try and rebuild these stocks. I've always said that we need to protect salmon from saltwater to headwater and everywhere in between to make change. And so that means, in Alaska and right up to the sacred headwaters. And so I think we need more selective fishing gear and fishing techniques. We need to get rid of these draggers. We need to get rid of these trawlers. I know this is hard for people to hear because it's their lifestyle, it's their livelihood, but we need to do better. You know, the seiners, the sport fishers, we need to have better fishing gear. You know, the sport fishers, I was taught that you never played with your fish, you know. And just closing off, I'd just like to say that, you know, I'm not asking Alaskans to stop fishing. I'm asking them to better target the fish that they're after. You know, more terminus fisheries. If it's a pink salmon fishery, then go closer to where the fish are headed, and you know, let some of these fish that are going to rivers in BC and Washington, give them a chance. You know, they need a migration corridor, somewhere where they're protected, they can safely pass. In BC, we've been working on salmon protection for decades, and now we just need your cooperation in Alaska. And I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirby. So one of the first questions that popped up here, which is definitely worth mentioning, is the impact of the Alaska factory trawl fishery. And I'm wondering if one of you on the panel wants to just speak to the impacts from that fishery and how it factors into the bigger picture of Alaskan impacts on BC and Washington, Oregon, California stocks.
I can jump in if you like. It's another significant issue. You know, it's not only in Southeast Alaska, it's also off the BC coast as well. And so, you know, for example, we met Kirby and Kate, and we met with the Haida about a month ago and discussed this issue with them directly. It's a big concern of a lot of Indigenous groups and others along the coast. So yeah, just accounting for and pushing for reforms in that fishery. We have colleagues who are working on that issue in different processes here in British Columbia. In Alaska, we're not as involved. You know, we don't have any seats at tables there or anything. I know that a lot of folks in Alaska are really making this issue front and center. We have conservation colleagues in Alaska who are putting significant amount of effort into this, or ramping up effort as we speak. So there will be a lot more attention paid to this. And I know it's you know, we've heard about for a long time in terms of the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea and its impacts on the Yukon River, et cetera. But they also, one of the things I just found out this morning is that there's some information now on genetic stock ID of salmon by caught in those fisheries. So we'll be collecting that information and assessing that as well to understand the impacts on British Columbia salmon populations.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. So there was a question here about the Marine Stewardship Council certification. So I was just wondering, maybe Kate, if you wanted to speak to that, and or Dave, and mention the objection as well. So how are we dealing with the Marine Stewardship Council blue washing of the salmon and these Alaskan salmon fisheries, and yeah, what are we doing about that? Kate, do you want to?
Yep, sure, I can. Yeah, and Dave, feel free to jump in if I miss anything. But yeah, so Alaska salmon are certified as sustainable by the Marine Stewardship Council and others. And we completely disagree that it's a sustainable fishery. There's lots of things to talk about there, but that is a big focus of our campaign. And that's how, you know, an area where you can help us out by going onto the website and sending letters to them. We have had meetings with them and do feel like we've garnered attention, but you know, there's a lot of process behind there. So the fishery is actually undergoing reassessment right now for recertification that is sustainable. We've been engaged in that process. We've provided feedback. We've provided evidence that the numbers and evidence that they're using is not correct. And actually, we just, I think on Monday or Tuesday, filed a notice of objection to the determination that the fishery is sustainable. So stay tuned on that. But you know, we're very involved, and so that's on the sort of inside of that, but then as well, things like this and just trying to get it out to consumers that it is greenwashing and it's not sustainable.
Great, thanks. And there was a question from Mark. Mark, good to see you on this call. Thanks for the question about steelhead. Just wondering, he's concerned that they're not getting enough attention in this campaign, and wondering if we can give them a bit more attention. So Dave, maybe could you field that one?
Absolutely. I thought Kate did a pretty good job of articulating our best assessment of steelhead interceptions, but a key audience for us here in the Pacific Northwest are people who use these fisheries. So for sure, Mark, a key job for us is to reach the steelhead community with this information and get them involved. And we're working really hard on that as we speak. And hopefully you'll be seeing a little bit more about steelhead from us this year. And of course, we'd love to have you and other steelheaders from across Cascadia involved in protecting this keystone species. Really, canary in the coal mine is a great way to describe them. When the steelhead stop showing up, as they have in recent years, you know there's a problem.
Great, thank you. One question that's I'm just going to throw in there because I hear it asked a lot is, Alaska has a reputation for being a sustainable seafood producer and managing their salmon really well, managing their fisheries really well. And so, and that seems at odds with what we've been finding out and hearing and talking about. So, yeah, what's with that? I was wondering if, Kirby, I haven't gone back to you yet. So if you wanted to offer any thoughts on that.
Sure. I just wanted to add a little bit to what I said earlier. Talking to some of the First Nations that I work with in British Columbia and in Washington and in Southeast Alaska, some of them are getting next to zero for food and sustenance purposes, social, ceremonial, cultural, etc. So I just want to echo what Greg said about, and I think others said that, there's a fairly simple solution to this. And I want to echo what I said earlier is that, we're not asking you to stop fishing. We're asking you to better target the fish you're after. And I just wanted to mention hatchery fish too. I've often heard that, Bristol Bay is just, they're by the tens of millions. And the problem with hatchery fish is that these hatchery fish are out in the ocean competing for food along with the wild stocks. And so hatcheries aren't always the answer. They may be in some situations to rebuild stocks, but and I also want to say that I am a commercial fisher and I have been for almost 50 years. And I'm seriously looking at the techniques that we use as commercial fishers and how wasteful they are. And they are wasteful. I mean, we with the gill netters, once you handle a fish by the gills and you pull it out of that net and you think it's going to survive when you put it back in the water, it's not going to survive. There's no way. Seining, same thing. These fish are being crushed when they're pulled out of the water. They're not going to survive. So I want everybody to just kind of look at how they can do better. That's what I'm doing. I'm looking at how I can do better and helping others to do better as well. We need to start protecting salmon from saltwaters to headwaters and everywhere in between, or we're all going to end up with nothing. Our commercial fishery in Prince Rupert is down to, probably 50 or 60 boats. And I see it move. I see it constantly moving up the coast and it's coming to Alaska. If we don't do something, it's going to be too late pretty soon. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks, Kirby. Really good points. One question I think is worth hitting quickly is Paul Hanna asked, why do most of the released Chinook from the seine fishery die? Probably could apply that to anything released Yeah, go for it, Greg.
I can answer that. Before I get there, though, I just want to add to what Kirby was saying. It's moving up the coast. So there's, I mentioned before that Alaska's having a lot of problems with their own Chinook populations throughout most of the state. So they're already seeing some of these issues that we're facing. And it's happening in some places for their own wild chum populations. They're also in Southeast Alaska, a lot of their sockeye populations aren't doing very well. So, they they're having a harder time ignoring the problems in their own backyard, and maybe they better relate to what we're saying here south of the border as time goes on, because this is moving north and it is becoming a problem and it isn't going away. To answer Paul's question, no, why are so many, released Chinook and steelhead dying in Southeast Alaskan seine fisheries is because of how they harvest. So, seine is a huge net, and then they kind of they purse the bottom of the net, so it's a huge bag. They bring it inside the boat, and then in Southeast in Canada we put a dip net in and haul out 50 fish or whatever at a time, and you can throw them back into the water. But in Southeast Alaska, they literally haul hundreds, thousands of fish over the side of the boat at once. And if you look at the photos or video, the water is yellow and red because of feces and blood being squeezed out of those fish. So they're crushing those fish. And once they are on deck, even if they're going still alive, they're just flopping around, and there's a hole in the middle of the deck and they flop into the hole. So the chances of actually being able to find a steelhead or a Chinook hopping around with thousands of fish on a deck chaotically and release them back to the water is very low. So that's why when Kate says 90%, it's we don't actually have really solid numbers. That they should actually have independent monitors that provide that information to get us really and do studies to provide that information of how many of those fish are dying. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know the vast majority of them are dying. So steelhead, Chinook, and they can do it differently. We're doing it differently here in British Columbia. If our seine fishermen, if they do it properly, they probably get definitely below 20%, definitely above 80% survival, probably even close to 90% survival. And so they can do it. They can do it differently. And we're doing it differently here. It's just international best practices. So when Alaska says that they're the best managed fisheries in the world, it's really BS, because just have to look at their fishing practices and the lack of information they collect, the lack of DNA analysis, the lack of sharing that information with Canada. There's a whole host of problems here.
Yeah, it's pretty egregious. And I think the fact that they record zeros for those numbers of Chinook and steelhead that are caught in those fisheries, when we know it's hundreds, thousands that are being caught. Okay, we're getting near the end of our time here, and there's been some really good questions. If we didn't get to your question, Megan has just put in some email addresses here, so you can email those questions and somebody will get back to you. And yeah, I really appreciate again everybody taking their time. And so I just I'll have a final question, I guess, for Greg or anyone else who wants to jump in. But with all the issues facing our salmon today, why is Alaska such a priority?
Yeah, I mean, because it's now the biggest impact for many of our salmon steelhead populations, especially with North Coast, like Skeena steelhead, for example, Nass steelhead, but also a lot of our, they're catching millions of chums right across the border, and no chums, or very few chums, are showing up in our river systems on the north and central coast of British Columbia. There's Chinook populations which are in trouble up and down the coast. And I'm not saying that Alaska is definitely not the only problem. There's lots of problems. And as organizations, we're working and have worked for many years on improving our own fisheries. And we have a lot of work to do, but we've scaled back in Canada, seriously scaled back our fisheries. Like I said, they're 10% of what they used to be in terms of commercial fisheries harvest. And so Alaska is now the biggest impact for many of our salmon populations, and we can't rebuild these salmon steelhead populations without their help. It's simple as that. And so we have to do something about it, and we are, and this isn't going away. The problems are not just going to magically get better. And we're here for the long haul. We need people's help to deal with this issue. And we can do it. We've gone up against the Goliath many times of the past in campaigns and won. And so, and people, like Dave said, people really care about salmon and steelhead in this part of the world. And what's really encouraging to me is in having conversations and reaching out to people, people want to help, and we're seeing more and more people line up to help, and we're gaining people who have connections to politicians, people who know people buying these fish in the marketplace, people with legal expertise, a whole host, Indigenous leaders stepping up to also put pressure on the federal and provincial governments, et cetera. So this is really encouraging to me. I just see things starting to snowball in this campaign, and so we're just getting started here, and we're gonna deal with this issue, and it's not going away for Alaska.
Right on. Okay, well, we're pretty much out of time here. I just wanted to thank Kirby, Kate, Dave, Greg for speaking, and Deanie and Megan for keeping us organized here on the back end, and everybody for joining and taking time out of your day for this. Please do go to that link to take action on this campaign, and that'll get you on our contact list so you can get updates, and get the updated report when it comes out. It really is going to take all of us working on this issue. And, there are a number of issues that we're working on. So, just to make sure that that's clear as well, other fisheries issues, habitat, fish farms, you can go to SkeenaWild.org and watershedwatch.ca to see what our organizations are doing on some of those other issues. But this campaign is a really big deal, and we really need your help. So please go take action at the Alaska's Dirty Secret website, or those other links that Megan has shared in the chat, and help get the word out about this issue. Share our posts on social media with your friends. Get one of these bumper stickers, hands off our salmon, and donate if you can to help us keep the lights on so we can keep doing this work. So I think we'll close it there, and thanks again for your time, everybody.